Hello, my name is Moises Gaona, and this is my presentation alongside with Adrian Verdin about the required SCOTUS cases. The first case is Marbury v. Madison, 1803. Facts. Before losing the election of 1800, the Federalist Party had assigned many Federalists into judges. William Marbury, one of the appointed judges who never received his commission, petitioned the Supreme Court for Jefferson to deliver commissions after he ordered Madison not to deliver them. The holding. The Supreme Court decided that Congress can't pass laws that override the Constitution, which ended up establishing the judicial review. The reasoning behind this was that although the commissions should have been delivered, the Judiciary Act of 1789 was considered unconstitutional. The decision made by the Supreme Court was that Marbury was entitled to his own commission, but Madison was not required to deliver them. And since there was no, all the judges had agreed upon like the same, that it was unconstitutional, there was no dissenting opinion. McCulloch versus Maryland, 1919. Second required SCOTUS case. Facts. Upon the creation of the Second National Bank of the United States by U.S. Congress in Maryland, Maryland legislature voted to impose a tax on all the banks in Maryland. However, upon the refusal of the United States government to comply with this law, a lawsuit was filed raising the question of whether the states could tax the banks or not. The holding made by the Supreme Court was that the states cannot tax federal institutions, which ended up establishing the supremacy of the United States Constitution and how the federal laws have a higher amount of power and importance over the state laws. The reasoning behind this was that due to the implied powers by Congress, the federal government has the ability to establish national banks even if it's not necessarily stated in the Constitution because of the power to manage taxes and money. Also, due to the supremacy of the Constitution, federal laws are more powerful than state laws. The decision was that the Supreme Court ruled that Congress has the power to establish a national bank under the necessary and proper clause, and the Maryland can't tax the national bank. And the dissenting opinion was like there was none because due to an unanimous decision of other justices. Requires SCOTUS case number 3, Schnegg versus United States, 1919. The facts. As the U.S. entered World War I, the U.S. passed the Espionage and Sedition Act, which prevented people from criticizing the government. After publishing anti-draft leaflets, Schnegg was charged for violating the 1917 Sedition and Espionage Act. He argued that the draft was denied by the 13th Amendment. Holding. The Supreme Court decided that freedom of speech and press can be limited if they create a clear and present danger, which is what was like happening in this situation. The reasoning behind this was that the Espionage Act was appropriate due to wartime, therefore it did not violate the First Amendment. The decision made by the Supreme Court was that the statement that the statement created a that a statement that creates a clear and present danger are not protected by the First Amendment. The dissenting opinion that there was none because all justices agreed. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. The facts of this is the fourth required SCOTUS case. The Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, had a separation of elementary schools between white and African American students. The NAACP in Topeka sought to change this established policy of segregation by challenging the constitutionality of it based on the violation of the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection. The holding made by the Supreme Court was that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The reasoning behind this was that the Supreme Court had concluded that racial segregation in public schools created an unequal educational opportunities for the students. The decision made by the Supreme Court was that racial segregation of educational facilities is inherently unequal. So therefore, the court unanimously ruled in favor to end the legal segregation in public schools. And because of the unanimous ruling, there was no dissenting opinion. Favorite required SCOTUS case. Baker versus Carr, 1962. Facts. Tennessee state constitution requires the state to redistrict legislative boundaries every 10 years, but they failed to do so and still used boundaries made in 1901. Charles Baker, a resident of an urban area, sued the state after feeling that his vote was less valued than the people from rural areas. The holding made by the Supreme Court was that drawing lines around state electoral districts can be reviewed by federal courts. The reasoning behind this was that the Supreme Court had the authority to review the case because it addressed the Equal Protection Clause. Decision. Federal courts the decision made by the Supreme Court was that federal courts are allowed to review cases over electoral boundaries. The dissenting opinion of this case was that there is no good legal standard to judge political districting, and the question should have been left for legislator political and the political system to decide. Sixth SCOTUS case. Angel versus Vitali, I don't know. 1962. Facts. In New York, the Board of Regents created a prayer to God to be used for opening each school each school day. This led to families and institutions questioning the constitutionality of advocating for a certain religious faith. They claimed this violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. The holding made by the Supreme Court was that it is unconstitutional for a public school to officially recite a prayer due to the fact it violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. The reasoning behind this was that uh, the Supreme Court stood by this holding because they determined that a state-sponsored prayer in a public school would be violating the Establishment Clause of no government involvement in religious activities by breaking the separation of church and state. The decision behind this making was that the government ruled that public the decision behind the decision that the Supreme Court decided to hold was that the government ruled that public schools could not initiate any form of religious activity uh, because government facilities and that government facilities should remain neutral on religious dilemmas. The dissenting opinion was that the Establishment Clause should not have been used to strike down the practice of a voluntary and non-demolitional prayer in public schools. Supreme Court case number 7, Gideon versus Wainwright, 1963. Facts. Gideon filed a habeas corpus petition after he was denied a lawyer. The Florida Supreme Court would deny his habeas corpus, which ended up causing the arrival of this case. And the holding behind this was that the Sixth Amendment. The holding that the Supreme Court decided on was that the Sixth Amendment right to a lawyer applies to state courts as well. The reasoning was that the right to assistance of counsel is a fundamental right that applies to the states, via the Fourth Amendment, the 14th Amendment. The decision of the Supreme Court was that the right to a lawyer is a fundamental right required for a fair trial. In dissenting opinion, there was none because all justices agreed upon it. The eighth SCOTUS case is Tinker versus Des Moines, 1969. Facts. Due to the ongoing Vietnam War, a group of students decided to engage in a form of peaceful protest by wearing black armbands in school. In response to this mob movement, the Des Moines School District implemented a policy to prevent this, hence causing some of the students to be suspended. This raised the constitutional questions whether the district's newfound policy violated the freedom of speech protections guaranteed by the First Amendment. The holding of this. The Supreme Court concluded that the act of wearing armbands as a form of protesting was a form of symbolic speech, hence protected by the First Amendment's freedom of speech protections. Reasoning. Due to the fact that this form of protest caused no disruptions nor infringed anyone's rights, the students had the right to protest against the Vietnam War. Decision. Students' freedom of speech is protected even under school grounds as long as it causes no significant disruptions or violates the rights of others. The dissenting opinion. Schools should have the authority to regulate the conduct and expression of the students, especially when maintaining order and discipline. Supreme Court case number 9. New York Times versus the United States, 1969. Facts. The Nixon administration wanted to stop New York Times and Washington Post to publish classified Defense Department materials of the Vietnam War, citing that it was necessary to protect national security. The holding made by the Supreme Court was that the establishment of heavy presumption against prior restraint, even in cases regarding national security. The reasoning behind this establishment was that prior restraint wasn't justified as the government did not meet the requirements. The decision made by the Supreme Court was that the government can block newspapers on reporting classified government files without violating the First Amendment. The dissenting opinion was that there was a total of three justices who dissented due to the lack of facts and respect to the executive on national security. Supreme Court case number 10, Wisconsin versus Yonder. Facts. Due to their religious beliefs, the Amish parents withdrew their children from school after eighth grade and were hence prosecuted by the state of Wisconsin for having violated the state law of Wisconsin's compulsory education law, which requires all students to attend school until the age of 16, which led to parents appealing under the protection of the Free Exercise Clause. The holding. The Supreme Court determined that this compulsory law violated the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause. The reasoning behind this. The Supreme Court held this because they determined that the state's interest in universal education did not outweigh the Amish parents' constitutional right to be able to freely exercise their religion. The decision behind this. The Supreme Court finalized that Amish parents were allowed to remove their children from school after eighth grade without facing any penalties or punishments. The dissenting opinion was that partial dissent regarding Justice Douglas's belief that children's rights were being overlooked and whether they get to stay in school or not after the eighth grade. And the reason why this was partial is because he still agreed. However, this court, like he concurred, but he wasn't the concurring side. But he still raised this question, and so it's considered to be a partial dissent. Now for the SCOTUS case, required number 11 was that Shaw versus Reno, 1999. The facts. In North Carolina Congressional District, the apportionment was rejected because it created only two black majority districts. The holding made by the Supreme Court was that majority minority districts can be challenged if race is the only factor in creating the district. The reasoning behind this, determined by the Supreme Court, was that North Carolina's district irregular size could only be explained as race being a factor. The decision made by the Supreme Court was that the they ruled for Shaw and for the case to be reheard in lower courts rather than the Supreme Court. The dissenting opinion. Only discrimination intended to harm is prohibited by the 14th Amendment. Therefore, the case wasn't sided with Reno. The 12th SCOTUS case was United States versus Lopez of 1995. The facts. Alfonso Lopez Jr. was arrested for bringing a handgun to his high school, which caused him to be charged under federal law. The gun which caused him to be charged under federal law. The Gun-Free School Zones Act, which made it a crime to possess a gun in a school zone. Lopez argued that the federal government didn't have the power to regulate this under the Commerce Clause. The case questioned whether the federal government had the authority to make laws about guns in school. The holding. The Supreme Court held that the Gun-Free Zones Act was unconstitutional and over-exceeded its power. Reasoning. The Supreme Court focused on the limits which Congress has under the Commerce Clause and concluded that the federal government had overstepped its constitutional authority by passing the Gun-Free School Zones Act, as it did not regulate an activity with a substantial effect on interstate commerce. Decision. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Alfonso Lopez, declaring the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 unconstitutional. The dissenting opinion. The law was within Congress's constitutional power because it sought to address a significant social problem with potential economic effects, which is opposite to what the concurring side was saying. Oops. SCOTUS case required number 13? Yeah. McDonald versus Chicago, 2010. Facts. Otis McDonald sued the state of Chicago for its gun ban, stating that the 14th Amendment makes the Second Amendment applicable to local governments. The federal courts ruled for Chicago. The holding. The Second Amendment right to bear arms is applicable to the states. The reasoning behind this. The 14th Amendment clause due to process clause argues that right to self-defense is at the heart of the Second Amendment. The decision behind this. The decision that the Supreme Court made was that they ruled in favor of McDonald. The dissenting opinion was that incorporations should consider policy's impact and its effects on other constitutional values. The 14th SCOTUS case and the last one Is Citizens United versus FEC. Uh, Facts. Yeah, 2010. Facts. Citizens United wanted to show a movie about Hillary Clinton during the 2008 election, but couldn't because of a law that banned corporations from spending money on political ads close to elections. Citizens United argued that the law violated their right to free speech, raising the constitutional question about whether the government could stop corporations from spending money on political ads. The holding. The Supreme Court held that the government cannot limit how much corporations and unions spend on political ads, as it violates their right of speech under the First Amendment. The reasoning behind this. The majority concluded that free speech is essential in a democracy and that the government cannot limit political expression based on who is speaking or how much they spend. The decision behind this. The Supreme Court ruled that corporations and unions had the right to spend as much money as they want on political ads as long as they act independently and don't work directly with a candidate, as it's a form of protected speech under the First Amendment. Dissenting opinion. The dissent argued that the decision harmed fair elections that gave too much political power to corporations and the wealthy, hurting regular citizens in the process. That concludes our presentation regarding the required SCOTUS cases 1 through 14, presented by Moises Gaona and Adrian Verdin.